Good evening, everyone. My name's Shannon Laverne, and I'm with the City Manager's Office for the City of Greenville. We want to welcome you to tonight's presentation on the proposed changes to our tree preservation and protection ordinance. I'm very excited to have a couple of my colleagues from the city joining us this evening. We have Leslie Fletcher, who is our communications manager. Leslie also works with our neighborhood association, so any of you that work with our neighborhoods probably know Leslie well. And also, our presenter for this evening is Edward Kinney. Edward has led this effort with our team. We've been trying to work on this for a while, but Edward has really done the lion's share of the work on this project, and we're really proud to be able to start moving something forward for the community. Many of you may have joined us for our meeting in late July, and this is the follow-up meeting that we talked about at that point based on some of the comments that we received from the public after that meeting. Um, I would like to go ahead and let Edward get started with our presentation this evening. And I think we will be doing our best to monitor the chat, so thank you. I think we've also had a couple of questions in the chat, so Leslie and I will do our best to monitor that throughout the meeting. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Edward Kinney, our senior landscape architect for the city of Greenville, to begin the presentation on the next steps for our tree preservation and protection ordinance, and discuss with you some decision points that we would like to begin talking with the public about. So with that, Edward, good evening. Glad you're here, and I'll let you take it from there.
All right, thank you very much, Shannon. So, in order to get started, I'm going to share my screen with you, and I want to make sure that everybody can see what I'm seeing. Good, excellent. So if this were, if this were a live studio audience, I'd be able to ask through a show of hands how many people were able to attend the meeting that we held back in July on the 22nd. Unfortunately, since I can't see any of you, I'm going to assume most of you, since you're all so excited about this. So I want to give you a little background about what we presented on the 22nd. So we initially brought forward to you this idea that we're going to be doing a new tree preservation ordinance. And the reason we wanted to do this is because at the time we had shown that we were suffering some relatively dramatic losses in our tree canopy. Ever since 2001, we've been able to do flyovers, and we've seen that the tree canopy for the city of Greenville has been decreasing bit by bit. And we also talked about how it isn't really just occurring in sort of the larger developments, but it's actually occurring throughout the city, even in some of our smaller, more established neighborhoods. And when we presented this tree canopy information, we gave it to the design development group, and we also presented to a sustainability group. And we also presented to neighborhoods and the general public, talking about our new tree preservation ordinance. At that time, we had also talked about the benefits of trees. Why are they an important resource? What do they do for us? We talked about how the tree canopy provides habitat, but it also reduces soil erosion. It also contributes to our water quality. It reduces energy use in our individual homes, and it improves air quality. And it also increases property values. So what really came out of this discussion is this idea that Greenville's tree canopy is actually a resource. It's a publicly and privately held resource that benefits all of us. And so in talking about how we were going to change the ordinance, we also looked at some of the other ordinances that are out there, and we looked across the board at other municipalities that are here in South Carolina and municipalities that are here within sort of our upstate, foothill Appalachian region. So we went everywhere from the big ones like Charleston and Charlotte down to some of our smaller South Carolina upstate towns. And what we had arrived at was that when we looked at all of the standards, all of the ordinances from various municipalities, we really had come to the conclusion that Atlanta has probably, bar none, the most stringent tree preservation policy. And so we started looking at what elements of that ordinance we could adopt for Greenville and what would work here in our town. We are not Atlanta, but Atlanta has some good ideas. And so when we put forward our tree preservation ordinance goals, there were really three goals that we wanted to look at. Number one was that we simply needed to simplify the existing ordinance. It is a bear to get through currently, and we don't want that to be the case. We want it to be very cut and dry, very simple to use. But at the same time, at the end result of that simplicity is that more trees are preserved. And so that was goal number two, was that we're going to stabilize, increase potentially the canopy, make sure that we don't suffer the same loss we've been suffering for the last few decades. And this was our third goal, and this is very interesting, and I'd like everybody to pay attention to this one. Our third goal was that we should not impact single-family residences. Now, I'm asking you to pay attention to this one because we've gotten a lot of feedback questioning whether or not that was a good goal. So here's what we did. We released the draft that day following the presentation, and we set a 2-week deadline for all responses. Now, responses have been trickling in way past that 2-week deadline, and that's great. That's fantastic. But when we started to tally and organize, at that point, we had 27 responses. 20 of them were from individual citizens, and then 7 of them were actually group responses. And group responses are very interesting because even though I would receive, or we would receive, one packet of information, it was representative of a larger body of individuals who all sort of put their heads together and came up with a collective idea. And so those 7 groups were between engineering companies, advocacy groups, and special interest groups. Everybody really weighed in. And here's what we got, and this was very interesting. We went through every single response to the ordinance that was given to us, and we made note of how people were reacting to it. And we were able to catalog these reactions into 4 different types. There were folks who looked at a line of the ordinance and said, it really ought to be stronger than you've written it. We looked at folks who looked at a line of the ordinance and said, no, it really ought to be weaker than the way you have written it. And then there were some folks who just, made sort of tweaking language about some verbiage in the ordinance, where they're really kind of diving into the particulars. They weren't saying it should be stronger or weaker. They were just saying, change your comma, for instance. And then we got some folks who simply gave us a blanket approval. And they would say something like, what you've done is fantastic. Greenville needs something. We fully support whatever it is you're doing. So this blanket approval. And so as you can see from the matrix that you've got up on screen, there was a lot of blanket approval. There were a lot of folks who thought that we ought to write the ordinance even stronger than we have written it. And there are some folks who thought that we should write it a little bit more weakly. So the second thing we studied was the conversations that people are having. So this is a really interesting matrix. Every time somebody made note of a particular issue, we would write it down. And whenever somebody mentioned it again, we put a little checkbox next to it. And so what started to emerge was this understanding of what the top topics were that are occupying people's thoughts. And as you can see here on the left, I've constructed what is essentially a top 10 list, right? So these are the conversations that are occurring around the tree protection ordinance. And here are the top 3. The top 3 is that single family exemption. And if you remember, that was one of our original goals. So we're going to revisit that. And the next conversation that people are all having is this fee in lieu of program. So what the fee in lieu of program says is that if you are required to plant a tree and you're not able to, then you can pay a fee in lieu of. And that fee goes into a bank, or rather a fund, and that fund is then used to plant trees elsewhere in the city. Now, this is something we currently do already. And then the third hot topic is the inclusion of affordable housing. So we had written in an exemption so that if you were a developer were doing affordable housing, then their tree mitigation would not be as steep. And so what we're going to do over the next 15 minutes here is we're going to dive into those top three topics: the single family exemption, the fee in lieu of program, and the inclusion of affordable housing. And we're going to dive into some of the details. And at the end of this presentation, we're going to give you a survey, and we're going to ask you to chime in directly on these three things. Now, the other 7 topics that you see up there, we'll also talk about very briefly, just so you all understand what it is that folks are talking about. So let's jump into this decision point number 1. Right. So here's what emerged. We have 3 big topics. We have 3 decision points that we need your guidance on. So the first decision point is this exemption of the single family. So as you remember, it was stated one of our goals was to exempt single family from the ordinance, from tree protections. Well, interestingly enough, 57% of respondents specifically asked for single family to be included. 36% of respondents provided that blanket approval that we talked about earlier. Now, blanket approval, said, whatever you're doing is great. Now, it just so happens that single family is exempted. So when you're providing that blanket approval, are they really interested in that exemption, or were they just saying, give us whatever you can? And then only 7% specifically asked that single family be excluded from tree protections. So you can see this is a decision that we need some clarity on. So I'll give you some more details that might help you understand why this might be important. If we look at the Greenville tree canopy right now, and we are very fortunate in that we had a grant come to us simultaneously just a month or so ago from the Green Infrastructure Center and from the South Carolina Forestry Commission. And they were able to provide us with a flyover of Greenville's tree canopy. And what did we discover? We discovered that 37% of our city is impervious. That means it's roadways, it's sidewalks, it's building pads and parking lots. 25% is pervious. That's grass, right? And our tree canopy occupies 36% of our coverage. So only 36%, about 1/3 of the city of Greenville, has trees on it. Now let's break that down even further. Of that 36% of treed area, who is contributing most significantly to it? And who is at danger of losing the most? So of that 37% of the canopy, nearly half is zoned single family. Another 20% is zoned service district, which does include some housing, some single family and multifamily housing. And then you can see the rest of the breakdown. Commercial, office, multifamily, all about 12%, respectively 11%. Within the actual city right-of-way, within our streets, for instance, just under 9% of our canopy is on city right-of-way. And then a very, very small percentage is within the industrial areas. So you can see that, quite frankly, the vast majority of the canopy is being held by private single-family zoned areas. So when we come to decision point number 2, this is the fee in lieu of program. So as it currently stands, the trees that are protected right now are 20-inch trees and 40-inch trees. And you can see they have a relatively small mitigation, right? So 20-inch protected trees that fall within buffers and setbacks. We have a replacement of 2 4-inch trees, or you can do 4 2-inch trees. And how does that work out? We allow a fee in lieu of about $150 per tree. So what that means is that if you were to take down a 20-inch tree, you would be assessed a fee of $600. With the proposed, we actually changed the definition of where those historic trees are located. And then we also changed the formula for how the fee in lieu of is calculated. And in this case, we did rely upon Atlanta's formula. So when looking at that one, 53% of respondents asked that we actually bring the fees up higher than we had indicated even in this proposed ordinance. Again, 40% of respondents provided that blanket approval, just saying, hey, anything you give us is better than what we have. And only 7% of respondents said, no, we think the fee should be lower. So let's dive into what that means. So I've drafted up a little example here. And again, this is just an example. And what I've shown is I've shown a half-acre lot. And this is an imaginary lot, but you can see this lot has got several trees that are drawn on it. And if you were to clear cut that now, the total cost would be about $1,800. That is what you would be assessed for completely wiping out every tree that's on that lot. With the new formula, it's quite a bit steeper than that. It can go up to $18,000. This is significant. And because it's significant, I feel that this is a decision point that we need people to weigh in on more. So this will be the second thing that you all are voting on. That being said, I think there are a couple things to look at. As someone said, and I think this is a very interesting point. So I'm gonna borrow someone's verbiage. They said, look, ultimately the goal is not to halt development, it's not to penalize development, but it's to discourage thoughtless development. Right? And we'll do that in favor of better and more sustainable designs that preserve our shared resources and ultimately improve our communities. That's it, right? We don't want to halt or discourage development. We simply need better development. And there's an example here where I think you can find that balance point. And there's something else that I think it's important to think about. And that is that there are other ways that we can tweak this formula so that it doesn't impact single family quite so much, right? So what I've highlighted in red on these two scenarios, on these two tables, are just the numbers and the calculation that we can change. We can change the definition of what is a protected tree. Currently, a protected tree is 20 inches. We would like to bring that down. In our last ordinance, we talked about bringing it down to 6 inches. There are other municipalities that have it at 8 or 10. The other thing that we can change the formula on is that assumed rate of a per tree market rate. Right now, we charge $150. We can change that. We can bring it down. So we can alter this formula to make it less onerous or less financially burdensome. Do we want to? We don't know. That's why we're turning to you. Because again, looking at that earlier slide, the majority of folks asked for trees to be, or asked for fees to be higher. Some folks said, no, we want it lower, and other people gave us that blanket approval. So quite frankly, we need your input and we need your direction on this one. And so now I'll talk about that third big decision point, and that's the inclusion of the affordable housing exemption. Now, it's very interesting. The way we wrote it is we said for any new multifamily developments, heritage tree removal fees may be waived at the administrator's discretion with the inclusion of at least 10% affordable and/or workforce housing. Now, it's very interesting because a lot of people pushed back on that. Vast majority of people called out and said, no, we think this is a terrible idea. But I think it's important for everyone to understand why we did that. We did that because someone asked a very, very interesting question. One of our counselors asked a very interesting question when this project first got started about a year ago. They said, if developers are getting charged a fee, will they not potentially pass that fee down to the consumer? And if that is the case, how does that potentially undermine our desire, our push for more affordable housing? And so this is why we came up with this exemption. We did it to try to help, to try to make sure that higher construction costs were not getting passed down to the consumer. That being said, there are a lot of folks who still fear that if we allow this exemption to go through, then affordable housing areas could become completely devoid of trees. And I think that's a legitimate concern. And so 58% of you said we don't want it, and 42% of you said, gave us that blanket approval. So this, I think, is a really critical third decision point that we'd love to have some input on. So real quick, I want to just sort of get everybody up to speed on what the remaining themes were, those top 10 themes we talked about, and how the ordinance is addressing them. So folks had some really great ideas about the protection of trees during construction, about improving the footprint of protection, improving the type of protection that's offered. Everybody really had some great ideas, and I think we'll follow through on those in the new ordinance. Again, there was just a lot of blanket approval and support. People loved what we were doing for the most part. The next thing to look at is a refined invasive species list. We are going to do that. That has been rewritten, codified, and we'll be sticking to that after a lot of input from our development partners. Many people acknowledge that this new ordinance may require a higher level of supervision, and so they noted a need for additional staff. Some folks noted the protection of our neighbors' trees when there's one development occurring. How are we making sure that we are protecting the neighbors' trees? So I'm glad to see that people are thinking that way, and that is something that we actually do currently address in our development process. We had a lot of calls for people to directly address clear cutting issues, just this mass grading that we see of sites, prior to development. And I think there are some things that we can do about that. Certainly, again, going back to this idea that we are trying to encourage better development, not necessarily trying to, halt development, but actually to encourage people to think more critically about how you design around your significant resources, right? How do you build a multifamily housing development? How do you build a mixed-use community that at the end of the day leaves those clusters of trees intact, leaves those big heritage trees intact for everybody's benefit? That's what we're hoping to create here. And then finally, what people were talking about is just redefining and expanding the definition of what a protected tree is. So again, right now, protected trees are 20 inches. We're thinking about bringing that down to 6. But again, we can slide that, as I showed in that earlier slide. So here's where we come to your part. And that is that we have posted a survey online, and we are asking you 3 simple questions. And these are those 3 decision points that we spoke to. How should tree protections be extended to existing single-family residences? There are 3 options. I think they should be protected at the same rate as new development. They should be protected at a lesser rate than new development. Or we can keep on doing what we're doing, which is not protecting them at all, even though they're 47% of our canopy. The next decision point is, should fees associated with that fee in lieu of program be changed from what we've suggested? They could be increased, they could be decreased, they could remain the same. And I want to point out that when we post the survey, there are options for you to add in additional comments. So we're still open to new ideas, fresh ideas, whatever you have to say. And then that final question is, should the new ordinance allow for a fee reduction if affordable housing is part of that development? Yes, it should. No, it should not. And again, do you have any other suggestions? So we are so eager for you to comment that we've provided you 3 different ways to access the survey. I provide you, there are two websites, greenville.sc or greenvillesc.gov/201/landscaping-trees. You can also navigate to that page by going to the City of Greenville's website, go to the Planning Department page, and on the Planning and Department page, there's a big screen for landscaping and trees. If you click on that, it will take you to another screen that shows you the survey. And of course, you can just you can go to this publicinput.com website and enter. So we're going to leave the poll open for the next 2 weeks. It should be live right now if you'd like to fill it out, and we will close it on October 13th. Based on your input, we're going to tally those responses. We're going to share them with council and leadership, and we're going to alter the ordinance as guided by public input and leadership. And then we will submit that second and hopefully final draft to the Planning Commission and to council in the November-December timeframe. And I just want to state, as always, if there are any questions, if you have any concerns, if you need clarification on any issues, you can reach me at the email that I provided on screen, ekinney@greenvillesc.gov. And with that, Shannon, I will turn it back to you or open it up for any questions that came in.
Thank you, Edward. So we did have a couple of questions come in that I'm going to start with. And if anyone else would like to put their questions either in the chat or in the question and answer, Leslie and I will do our best to make sure we get those addressed before. Then at the end, we'll unmute it for all participants. And so I'll put everyone on warning so that they'll know they're going to get unmuted if there's anyone who didn't get their question addressed. So the first question is in our question and answer box, Edward. And the question is, are there any provisions for selective cutting to improve the overall canopy's health?
So, interesting question. So pruning is currently allowed. We do have recommended guidelines for pruning. For selective cutting, I guess I need a little more detail to answer that question. Pruning is certainly allowed. Pruning is allowed even of heritage trees if you have an arborist doing it and if you've gotten permission from the city. And we are planning on using any sort of fee in lieu of, as we currently have, goes towards tree planting, but it can also be used for maintenance of the canopy within the existing right-of-way. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Edward. The next question that came in was, if a large heritage tree is diseased or dangerous and needs to come down on an existing single-family property, would the homeowner be held to the same guidelines or fee for replacement?
No, they would not. So there is an exemption written in currently that would allow trees that are diseased or damaged to be brought down without incurring any sort of penalty.
Thank you. Would you be able to go back over the example again?
Sure.
There were a couple of questions from the example. If you could please go back over that again.
This one?
Yes. Yes, that's the example. If you could go back through that, that would be helpful.
Okay, sure. So the way our ordinance is currently written, the only trees that are afforded any protections are trees that are greater than 20 inches that are located within setbacks and buffers. So what I've drawn on the left-hand side is an imaginary lot. And within that imaginary lot, there are setbacks and buffers, and that basically defines sort of your construction envelope. And so currently right now, the only trees that would be that would be designated for saving are that 28-inch and that 32-inch tree that are right up there towards the front, the bottom of the example. And our replacement for those currently is that you would have to replace a 20-inch tree between 20 and 40 inches would have to, I'm sorry, between 20 and 30 inches would have to be replaced with 2 4-inch trees. And a tree larger than 30 inches would have to be replaced with 4 4-inch trees. Now, if you were developing that lot and designing it and you did not have room to place those trees on your site following construction, then you could do a fee in lieu of. And the fee in lieu of is basically charged at a market rate. And what we do is we assume $150 per tree, right? So if you owed us 2 4-inch trees, those 4-inch trees are equivalent to 2 2-inch trees. So basically 4 2-inch trees. So you'd be assessed $600. All right. So looking at the proposed, the way if we were to take the ordinance as the proposed ordinance and we were to gameplay it out, what it does is it extends protection to trees that are greater than 6 inches, right? And what it also does is it also allows for those really, really monster trees, those huge ones that are within the interior of a lot, like that 45-inch tree that I've shown on the interior of the lot. It provides protections for those as well. So this does 2 things. One, it lowers the caliper of the trees that should be saved. And 2, it actually extends protections into the property so that those really, really big trees that are sort of hidden from public view, but may be of great benefit to the public, are still preserved. Because it's really interesting when you think about how our ordinance is written right now, the only thing it really does is it protects trees that are visible. That's it. It protects trees that are within the setbacks and the buffers. What can your neighbors see? What can the public see? It doesn't do anything to protect trees that are outside of the public's view. But just because they're outside of the public's view doesn't mean that they aren't still filtering air and improving water quality and doing all those things that trees do. So in the example that I've shown, all of the trees from 6 inches on up are extended these additional protections. So those additional protections, again, would be based on that $150 per tree fee, or in the case of heritage trees, significant trees, the 28-inch, the 32-inch, the 45-inch, there would be additional saving measures for those. And that formula is taken from the Atlanta model. Now, I want to stress that if I can push forward to this slide, these things are things that we can still tweak. If it is decided that we don't want single-family homeowners to bear that same burden that a developer of a multifamily or of a commercial property would bear, we can alter that so that there are lesser protections for single family. And we can do that by changing those numbers of what is saved or how much the fees are that are imposed upon, for the destruction of a tree. And so highlighted in red are those flexible points that we have at our disposal.
Thank you, Edward. Another question is the 1-for-1, does that pertain to quantity of tree or does it also include the type of tree?
The 1-to-1 refers to the actual diameter of the tree. So, and again, based on the Atlanta model, that is, if you take down a 10-inch tree, you must replace it with 10 inches worth of trees. So that means 5 2-inch trees or replace it with 2 5-inch trees. That's a 1-to-1 caliper.
Thank you, Edward. Another question or comment that has, I think, kind of a question built in is there any reconsideration of the magnitude of the reimbursement fees for trees that are taken down in a development? Referencing Atlanta's new ordinance is increasing these fees by a factor of more than 7 times from our proposal. It's in the chat if you want to look at the.
Sure.
If we could address that.
Okay, I'm trying to find it here. So I'm sorry, I'm not seeing it anywhere. Could you?
But I'll just repeat it for you.
Yeah.
Is there any reconsideration of the magnitude of the reimbursement fees for trees that are taken down in a development? Referencing Atlanta's new ordinance is increasing these fees by a factor of more than 7 times from our proposal.
Wow. So it's interesting. We actually are having a conversation with the gentleman tomorrow who sits on Atlanta's tree commission, and we'll be picking his brain quite a bit. But is there any? So I guess you're asking if we are thinking about changing the magnitude of the tree beyond what we currently have. What we're currently showing, no, there is not. So I think that what we're currently showing is fairly significant, and I would not be inclined to go much higher than that right now.
Edward, there was a question pertaining to how the decision points came about, and that was based on comments received after the first public meeting.
Correct.
But I think there were also comments that you received back even when this started in 2018. But would you mind reviewing quickly the process that got us to this point tonight, as well as the comments that were received after the first meeting, and if those were and how those were broken down by individual versus groups?
Sure. So we essentially read every single comment that came into us, and every time somebody brought up an issue, we would write it down. And when someone brought up that issue again, we would just put a checkbox next to it. So there a lot of people kept coming back to similar themes, kept coming back to the same conversation over and over and over again. And it wasn't necessarily being generated by us, it was being generated by the comments that were just coming in. And so when we tallied up what those conversations were, this is how we ended up with this top 10 group that you're looking at on the screen right now. And the 3 biggest things that people were talking about was the single family, the fee in lieu of, and the affordable housing. Now, not surprisingly, those are also the top 3 things that people were disagreeing about amongst themselves. So the other 7 that I've listed, pretty much people were talking about it, but they all sort of agreed with the same, in principle, they all were on the same page. But those top 3 are the one where there was some difference of opinion. And so that's how it came about. Now, that's not to say to talk about the individual versus the group. That's not to say that if we got a conversation point from a group, does that really mean that all 12 people in that group were thinking about it? I don't know. There's no way for me to tell. What I do know is that that group posited it as an idea that they wanted to follow through on. And so that's what we've done here. And again, when we open up the survey, and the survey should be open now, there is a field at the bottom where if you have anything else that you want to comment on or contribute to, it's wide open. So you can still put in more information if you want to continue to add to the conversation of our tree ordinance.
Thank you, Edward. I'm going to move to some of our question and answer section. And then I will still at the end unmute it for anyone who did not get their questions answered. We want to make sure everyone has an opportunity to do that. Okay, the first question, does the ordinance include the current calculation for how many trees need to remain on a property per the ratio of impervious surface per lot area? Meaning, if you exceed or meet current criteria for the amount of trees needed, does the fee apply?
No, it would not apply. So that's a great question. So I think what you're asking is, is there a methodology within the ordinance that says if enough trees are saved, will it offset the ones you cut down? And the answer is yes. Yes, there is.
Do the required street trees count as a replacement tree, or would replacements be in addition?
So lifting this from the existing ordinance, I believe that they do not count.
Next question, any thoughts to a site maximum cost, i.e. 5 to 15 acre suburban sites that might be annexed into the city?
Yes, that's an excellent idea. There are caps that are imposed in other municipalities, and I would absolutely recommend we do something similar.
Edward, next question. When we were able to write down comments on poster boards at the 2040 City of Greenville Comprehensive Plan in person, many wanted to preserve green spaces. Many wanted to keep the green in Greenville. Does this proposed plan tie in with the 2040 Comprehensive Plan?
You know, I think it really does, actually. I don't know if the 2040 comp plan has been shared with the public, but staff has seen a draft of it, and preservation of green space is strongly noted throughout. And so, yes, I would say that this will tie in with the overall desire to preserve and enhance our existing green space. Yes, absolutely.
Okay. At this point, I'm going to unmute all participants. So just want to put everyone on notice before we unmute so that anyone who wants to ask a question who has not yet had an opportunity to ask their question has that opportunity now. Thank you.
Oh boy, here it comes.
Quiet, man.
Anyone have a question? We'll put it back on mute.
No secret.
Okay.
Okay, I muted everyone. I still think that there's one question that I think that one of the attendees is asking about, referring to an initial survey. There really wasn't an initial survey. There was the public hearing in July, and the comments were received from that meeting.
Correct.
And there were 27, is that correct? But that included groups that that submitted as, is that correct?
Yep, that's exactly right.
Thank you, Edward, for clarifying. We had another question about what trees were preserved at the condos on West Stone that are hanging over the road, or preserved at the block on Woodruff Road starting at Roger Stone. What insects and animals lose their homes with any tree size taken down?
I I probably can't comment right now on those two particular developments. I'm not familiar with them, but we can certainly look into that and further. You're muted, Shannon.
Thank you. We'll get back to the attendee on that. Lincoln. The next question is, does the diameter requirement relate to all types of species of trees?
The answer is no. There are some species that were excluded because they're considered to be nuisance trees. All pine trees, actually, by request of our own arborist, were excluded because they have a tendency to break and damage property very, very easily.
Thank you. I'm going to now unmute one of the attendees that couldn't ask a question when we tried to unmute all. Just give me one moment, please.
And also, any trees that are already on the invasive species list are excluded.
Are sweet gums nuisance trees?
Yes. Yeah, they are.
Susan, I'm unmuting you now to ask your question. Susan, you're now unmuted. Susan, we can't hear you, so if you'll send it to us in the question and answer, we'll get back to you. Thank you. Okay, I've got the question. Can you please expand on why trees could not be included in developments with affordable housing? Could the exemption include the city covering the cost of trees as housing that is affordable to all income levels? This range goes up to a household earning $60,000, which is a priority of council.
Mm-hmm. So historically, what had happened is we had extended, we had extended the tree mitigation fees to absolutely every type of development. And when we brought this idea before council, gosh, maybe a year ago, someone asked the question. They said, if developers are having to pay higher fees for the removal of trees, will they not simply pass on those fees to the consumer at the end of the day with higher unit costs of individual units? And they said, if that occurs, then how doesn't that undermine our affordable housing initiatives? And so the solution to that problem was that we offered this exemption. And what the exemption said was that at the administrator's discretion, mitigation fees could be waived if the developer was including 10% affordable housing. So this is how we wrote it into this last ordinance. We got a lot of pushback on that. The pushback came sort of in two forms. One form was this misunderstanding that we were trying to protect certain development projects. The other pushback we got was this idea. They played out the scenario. They said, well, what will this eventually result in? Will this result in affordable housing developments that have 0 trees on the property? And if so, that's not a place we want to be. And so we really we were asked by council and by a lot of folks in the poll to take it out, and so we have removed it. Well, we are considering removing it based on how this upcoming poll turns out. That being said, while about half of you said please remove it, the other half just said, everything that you're doing is great. So does that really mean that they had thoroughly read up and were in favor of the affordable housing exemption? Or were they just sort of saying, blanket approval, everything is good? So this is one of those things where we just need some input on. But that is the history of why the affordable housing exemption was put into place. And we had left it open enough so that we leave the actual definition to be defined by the Community Development Division. So that way, if the definition changes over time, then the ordinance is flexible enough to capture that.
Next question. Has an exclusion for 100% affordable housing builders been considered?
No. No, we had not done that. We had listed it at 10%.
Okay. I think we are getting close to the end of the questions, but again, Leslie, did I miss anything, or do you have anything that we need to address tonight? Did we get everybody's questions?
And again,
I'm going to try to unmute one more time and make sure that if anybody has anything that they have an opportunity. Please note that Edward, Leslie, or I are happy to answer your questions offline also. Edward will answer any and all questions that you email him. I know because I get copied on the responses. And
at least you
we
think you
really
do.
appreciate the great attendance tonight. At one point, we had about 89 people on the call, so that's really great. So we really appreciate so many people coming out. But I'll unmute one more time to make sure that we've gotten everybody. And if not, I would really encourage you to send your questions to Edward. He will answer each and every one. And if we can't answer it, or it takes us a day or two to research it, he will let you know that as well. And his email address is below on the slide. It's also available on the city's website. And Leslie and I are happy to get that to you anyhow, any way. But if you get to the city's website, you'll be able to find them. So with that, I'll unmute one more time, see if we have any last questions.
In terms of the one-on-one replacement, you said it's based on the caliper of the tree. Doesn't necessarily the diversity, the trees being taken down and the ones being replaced. And I get the exemption for invasive, but still, if you're replacing it with just a whole bunch of crepe myrtles, I think that defeats the purpose of what we're trying to do here.
So that's an excellent point. And I think that was Doug speaking. But that actually is already written into our ordinances, and that is that depending upon the number of trees that you're putting in, there are varying levels of species diversity that you're required to put in, right? So that is, I can't remember the exact numbers, but if it's 3 or less trees, then there's one species. Between 3 and 5 trees, then you must go to 2. Between 5 and 10, it's 3 species. So that will still carry over, right? So if you're required, and it's an interesting point, if you take down one oak tree and you're required to put in, 6 trees to compensate, they would still need to have a diversity of species to them. Yeah, that's an interesting point. I'm glad you brought that up.
Okay, we're going to try again, see if there's anyone else.
Excuse. Can you explain again?
Needs to be replaced. It's down. What happened to it? Needs to be replaced now.
Melissa, you can call me after this is over?
Yeah, I'll
That's
call-
a lot of noise.
Okay.
Hearing none?
So we will save the chat, and if there's anyone we feel like we didn't get the questions answered, we will do our best to reach out to you all directly so that we can ensure that everyone has an opportunity to have their questions addressed as best we can. We want to do our best to do that. We encourage you to participate in the poll in our for the survey questions that will open later this evening and I think the link is live actually right now.
It is.
And then goes through October the 13th. Our hope is that we will have this ready to present to the Planning Commission in November. That is the current plan, but we will, obviously it'll depend on how things come back from the survey that we're getting ready to release. Finally, please keep a note on the city's website. We will keep notice up there of the next steps and any forthcoming meetings. We thank everyone for your participation tonight. We really appreciate it. We're excited that so many people are interested in this topic. And I thank Edward and Leslie for helping us through this meeting this evening, and Edward for a great presentation. With that, we'll go ahead and end it. I'll stay on the line for a couple more minutes in case anyone has any other questions, but we can go ahead and end the meeting at this point. Thank you.